Hello and welcome to this week's painting video, where we're going to continue working with glazes and scumbling over this one that you may have done last week. If you haven't done this exercise here, and just to remind you what I did here is that I washed very thinly over the whole surface with yellow ochre, sort of a very pale yellow ochre. Charged an area through here with a stronger yellow to sort of indicate a land mass. Did a little bit of wiping, I think, in some of the area through here of the ocean or the sea. And then over that, with heavy white opaque paint, built up a textured surface. So we're going to use that textured surface now to our advantage. In terms of how the subsequent layers of paint will now start to appear on them. What I'm going to be using is I'm using a particular medium, the Neo Miguel. This is very much a similar medium to what Turner would have used. It's a Gamblin medium. It's what's known as a thryxoscopic medium. So it's a medium that goes to like a jelly consistency, and you can see there in the bottle how it's sort of holding itself and it's jellified. But as soon as, and if I just gently shake it, it starts to liquefy and run. So it's good as a glazing medium in that regards, in that it can be, it holds itself, it doesn't run like some other mediums might do. But also too, that holding property and liquid property, Turner used to his advantage, and that with the one brush mark he could be adding quite impastoed and textured paint, and in the same time it going liquefied and spreading out. So there was a way of manipulating the paint on the surface. If you don't have Neo Miguel, don't worry, you can just be using any of your general painting mediums for some of these techniques. Just be aware though, it probably won't hold the paint as well for any impastoed effects. If you do want to include any of the more impastoed effects that you might see me using, it's where you could possibly think about adding some beeswax. Now, some of you, I have done running you through making that beeswax medium for protection of your brushes. I haven't got it here handy with me. But if you have made that recipe, which is purely just melting the beeswax and adding a small proportion of solvent into it once it's melted, that would be an adequate substitute to add a little bit of opacity, or not opacity, a little bit of body, a little bit of impasto to the oil paints. And which is something that Turner did use. He did use wax in his paints as well. So let's get started. We're going to start with just a very thinned out blue, and start to introduce some blue over this. I'm going to keep it quite thinned out. And you can be thinking about applying this in similar ways to what we've been looking at in terms of those watercolour marks, in terms of you don't just have to glaze it in solidly. You can now in this start to introduce some brush marks, and just be aware the more or the stronger the blue is, the more covering power it will have. So if you want an area that is particularly blue and covering that yellow, you want to be painting it down stronger. So you can see here in my mixing of the colour, there's an area up here where I'm strengthening the blue, and then an area down here where I'm weakening the blue. And that can be sometimes a useful process to have here on your palette going, that you're able to go backwards and forwards between the two and where you need it then. But what I'm first doing, and I'm not going to worry if I go onto the landmass, because we're going to start to use the fact that the blue over the yellow will create a greenness. We're going to use that to our advantage. And as I said, if there's an area that you want a bit more bluer, there you can see I'm going in there with some stronger colour. I'll just start to pull that out a little bit, because that's probably a bit too strong. You can start to see there's some areas there that I'm leaving like a reserve if we were talking about watercolour, but that I'm just letting those colours, all that colour underneath, to give that softness to what I'm doing here. All the time I'm thinking about the source of light too, in terms of the light maybe is coming from this direction. So if the light is coming from that direction in terms of our light source, is that the blue is going to be more extreme and stronger on this side away from the light source, as well as, and that helps amplify that feeling of light coming from maybe this side of the picture. The beautiful thing with this technique, of course, if underneath is nice and dry, you're able to wipe areas back. So have a cloth on hand, and we can start to maybe play with some areas there and increase that feeling of there being maybe shadows and things starting to form. Over that landmass. And by wiping back into areas, we're getting that feeling of light there. On that landform. Now we're getting more down here now into the ocean areas. And first of all, we're just going to work with some blue. And keeping that quite sort of thin. Now here you can start to see that colour being picked up and catching in that white paint. In those thicker areas there. So if you start to then work quite heavily, you're starting to very quickly get those areas of textured and variance. To the surface. you can then very gently wipe over the top. And that will start to pick out highlights of colour. Like so. Now remember, if you think back to the colour video that I did the other week where we talked about warming and cooling parts of the ocean and the sky using different blues, this is an opportunity to probably put into action some of those effects. And here I can, by just adding just a little bit of a stronger and cooler blue there, particularly, start to really push back that part of the ocean. And I'm working on particularly that part there because that's the part that would be the furthest away from me as the viewer. We can then, to create a little bit more greeniness and maybe some nice sort of things going, maybe to get a bit of choppiness going in this ocean, I'm adding just a little bit of, this is Indian yellow, so we're going outside of the yellows that we've used before, a very transparent yellow. And by mixing it with the greens, we'll start to get some lovely, by mixing it with the blues, we'll start to get some lovely greens starting to happen. So there might be some areas in this more shallow water just here that we just want a little bit more greeniness happening. And getting some of that choppy sort of effect. Now the thing with this effect of picking up those colours in through there is, and it's to experiment with less and more of that medium too, is the more of it you add in, particularly into a darker colour. So here I'm adding quite a bit. It's going to pick up quite a bit of the texture that I've got underneath. there we go. Again, might just work over an area. Just gently wiping. To let some of that texture come through. You can also be wiping gently with the brush too. So if I just clean that brush off, make sure it's well and truly dried out by just sort of dusting across the top. You'll pick up a little bit of texture. I would then probably now let that dry. Now, being very thin and very glaze-like, even in an oil, you'll find that this starts to dry quite quickly. Actually, before we let it dry, we might just intensify a little bit of light in that sky. So this is where we're going to come in with maybe a little bit of that Indian yellow. Ooh, there's a bit of niceness. And get a bit more glow like that. One final thing before we then stop and let it dry for a little bit is we're going to introduce a little bit of burnt umber. And mixing the burnt umber with some cobalt blue, getting a nice dark, and again thinned out. Picking up a little bit of that texture here now that this is starting to be on like a beach. And then wiping quite hard so that that paint's really down only into those crevices. And you can do this a few times. Remembering this is purely, this is just an experiment of technique. Don't worry about trying to produce a masterpiece. So at that stage there, I would just now let this dry before we add any more into it in the next stage. Now that that has dried somewhat, it's still a little tacky in a couple of spots. We can then further develop that with glazes and things over the top of it. So it's where we can look to now start adding areas of more detail. So, and again, it's still with that Neo Megelp or Meglop. So this time we can start to add white. Now the beautiful thing when you add the Neo Meglop to the white is that ability then to kind of float colour over the top. So it's sort of here we can start to sort of think about the kind of day that we want to sort of create with this, and it's so here you can see just this floating. We're able with the Neo Meglop, it sort of is this transparent opaqueness that you can be adding in terms of this white, and in areas just sort of dancing it across the top again and picking up that some of that texture and creating the look. You can start to then think about I'm just going to go in there with maybe a few more dark, sort of it's sort of a sea that's starting to churn and heave. And that maybe, even though there's sort of that sun coming through, there's a little bit of sea mist and spray. Softening that edge through there. And there's quite a good start or basis of this idea of introducing all these textural elements and letting the paint do the work. So rather than trying to paint seaweed, I'm letting the paint create seaweed rather than the me paint individual waves. I'm letting the paint create the waves. I'm letting the paint create the light. And this is, you know, these are very much along the lines of how Turner would work, and then come in very much like I've shown you with some of those watercolours and things this week. Then with a fine brush and transparency, and maybe work in a little bit more extra detail or something like that. And if we're really going to turnify this one, there would have to be some sort of castle on the hill. Or some structure. something like that. The big thing with this week's exercise and further building upon these is just to play. Don't attack it with any too much of a preconceived idea of what it's going to look like at the end. Apply paint, wipe it off, scratch it off. I mean, I haven't used any troweling with a palette knife in this, but I spoke to you this week. He did use a palette knife, and there you can see maybe that might just a little bit of palette knife in there to give you an idea. There's no rights or wrongs in finding what works and what doesn't work. But as I said, don't forget, have rags there that you can be taking off as much paint as what you're applying, and building up and thinking about textures. Have fun, good luck, and I shall speak to you, as always, soon.